The Education of Little Tree by Forrest Carter. Fox and Hounds, page 120. It was late of a winter afternoon when Grandpa took old Maud and Ringer into the cabin because he said he didn't want them embarrassed before the other hounds. I figured something was up. Grandma already knew. Her eyes were twinkling like black lights, and she put a deer shirt on me, just like Grandpa's, and placed her hand on my shoulder like she done him, and I felt might near growed up. I didn't ask, but I hung around. Grandma gave me a sack with biscuits and meat and said, "I'll sit on the porch tonight and listen, and I will hear you." We went into the yard, and Grandpa whistled up the dogs, and off we set, up the hollow by the spring branch. The hounds ran back and forth, hurrying us up. Grandpa kept his hounds for only two reasons. One was his corn patch, where every spring and summer he assigned old Maud and Ringer to stay and guard against deer, coon, hogs, and crow getting all his corn. Like Grandpa said, old Maud had no smell sense at all and was practically worthless on a fox trail, but she had keen hearing and eyesight, and this gave her something she could do and take pride in knowing she was of worth. Grandpa said if a hound or anybody else has got no feeling of worth, then it's a bad thing. Ringer had been a good trail dog. He was getting old now. His tail was broke, which made him look disheartened, and he couldn't see nor hear very well. Grandpa said he put Ringer with old Maud so he could help and feel that he was of worth in his old age, that it sort of dignified him, which it did, for Ringer walked around right stiff-legged and dignified, especially during the periods when he was working at the corn patch. Grandpa fed old Maud and Ringer at the barn up in the hollow during corn raising time, for this wasn't far from the corn patch. They stayed there faithful. Old Maud was Ringer's eyes and ears. She would see something in the corn patch and take off after it, raising howls like she owned that corn patch. And Ringer would follow, doing the same. They'd go chasing through the corn, and maybe old Maud would run right past a coon if she didn't see it, for she sure couldn't smell it. But Ringer, following behind her, could. He'd put his nose to the ground and go braying after that coon. He'd run that coon out of the patch and hold on to his trail by smell until he run into a tree. Then he'd come back kind of sad, but him and old Maud never give up. They done their job. The other reason Grandpa kept hounds was for pure fun, trailing fox. He never used dogs to hunt game. He didn't need them. Grandpa knew the watering and feeding places, the habit and trails, even the thinking and character of all the game far better than any hound could learn. The red fox runs in a circle when he is chased by hounds. With his den in the center, he will start on a circle, swing that measures maybe a mile, sometimes more, across the middle. All the time he's running, he'll use tricks, backtracking, running in water, and laying false trails, but he'll stick to the circle. As he grows tired, he will make the circle smaller and smaller until he retreats to his den. He dens up, they call it. The more he runs, the hotter he gets, and his mouth sweats out strong smells that the dogs pick up on the trail, and so get louder with their baying. It is called a hot trail. When the gray fox runs, he runs in a figure 8, and his den is just about where he crosses his trail each time to make the 8. Grandpa knew the thinking of the coon, too, and laughed at his mischievous ways, and swore a solemn oath that on occasion the coon had laughed at him. He knew where the turkey ran and could track a bee from water to hive with the look of his eye. He could make the deer come to him because he knew his curious nature, and he could ease through a covey of quail without stirring a wing. But he never bothered them except for what he needed, and I know they understood. Grandpa lived with the game, not at it. The White Mountain men were a hardy lot, and Grandpa bore with them well, but they would take their dogs and clatter all over the mountains, chasing game this way and that until everything run for cover. If they saw a dozen turkey, why, they killed a dozen turkey if they could. But they respected Grandpa as a master woodsman. I could see it in their eyes and the touching of their hat brims when they met him at the crossroads store. They stayed out of Grandpa's hollows and mountains with their guns and dogs, whilst they complained a lot about the game getting scarcer and scarcer where they was. Grandpa often shook his head at their comments and never said anything, but he told me they would never understand the way of the Cherokee. With the dogs loping behind, I trotted close behind Grandpa because it was that mysterious, exciting time in the hollows when the sun had sunk and the light faded from red to shady blood and kept changing and darkening as if the daylight was alive but dying. Even the dusk breeze was sly with a whisper, as if it had things to tell that it couldn't say out open. The game was going to its beds, and the night creatures was coming out for the hunt. As we passed the meadow by the barn, Grandpa stopped and I stood practical under him. An owl was flying toward us down the hollow, moving in the air no higher than Grandpa's head, and passed right by, making no sound, not a whisper, nor a whir of wing, and it settled silent as a ghost in the barn. "Screech owl," Grandpa said. "The one ye hear sometimes at night that sounds like a woman painting. Going to catch some rats." I sure didn't want to disturb that old owl and rat catching, and kept Grandpa between me and the barn as we passed. Dark fell in close, and the mountains moved in on either side as we walked. Before long, we came to a Y in the trail, and Grandpa taken the left. Now there was no more room for the trail except right on the edge of the spring branch. Grandpa called this narrows. Seemed like you could stretch out your arms on either side and touch the mountains. Straight up they went, dark and feathered with treetops, and left a thin slice of stars above us. Way off, a mourning dove called, long and throaty, and the mountains picked it up and echoed the sound over and over, carrying it farther and farther away until you wondered how many mountains and hollows that call would travel. And it died away. So far, it was more like a memory than a sound. It was lonesome, and I trotted right up on Grandpa's heels. None of the hounds stayed behind me, which I wished they would. They stayed ahead of Grandpa, running back to him now and then, whining and wanting him to send them off trailing. The narrow sloped upward, and before long I could hear big water running. It was a creek that crossed what Grandpa called Hanging Gap. We moved off the trail, up into the mountain above the creek. Grandpa sent the dogs off. All he had to do was point and say, "Go," and off they went, giving little yelps, like young'uns going berry picking, Grandpa said. We sat down in a pine thicket above the creek. It was warm. Pine thickets give off heat, but if it's summertime, you want to sit amongst oak and hickory or some such, because pine gets plumb hot. The stars were watering and moving around in the creek, riding on the ripples and splashes. Grandpa said we could commence to listen for the hounds in a little while when they picked up old Slick's trail. That's what he called the fox. Grandpa said we was in old Slick's territory. He said he had known him about 5 years. Most people think that all fox hunters kill foxes, but it's not true. Grandpa never killed a fox in his life. The reason for fox hunting is the hounds, to listen to their trailing. Grandpa always called off the hounds when the fox denned up. Grandpa said that when things had got monotonous for old Slick, he had gone so far as to come and sit in the edge of the cabin clearing, trying to get Grandpa and the hounds to trail him. It sometimes caused Grandpa all manner of trouble with the hounds as they yelped and bayed, with old Slick leading them up the hollow. Grandpa said he liked to slip up on old Slick when he was cantankerous and not in the mood for trailing. When a fox wants to den up, he will use ingenious tricks to throw off the hounds. And when he is playful, he will play all over the countryside. He said the best part was that old Slick would know he was being paid back for sashaying around the cabin and troubling Grandpa. Sure enough, the moon broke over the mountain a quarter used up. It sprinkled patterns through the pines and splashed lights off the creek and made thin silver boats of the fog tearing sailing slowly through the narrows. Grandpa leaned back against a pine and sprouted out his legs. I done the same. And put the victual sack right by me as it was my responsibility. Not far off, a big bay sounded long and hollow. "That's old Rippet," Grandpa said, and laughed low, "and it's a damn lie. Rippet knows what's wanted, but he can't wait, so he makes out like he's hit a trail scent. Listen how falsified his bay sounds. He knows he's a lying. Sure enough, it did sound that way." "He's damn sure lying," I said. Me and Grandpa could cuss when we wasn't around Grandma. In a minute, the other hounds let him know as they howled around him, not baying. In the mountains, they call such a bluffer dog. There was silence again. In a little while, a deep bay broke the stillness. It was long and far off. And I knew right then it was a real thing because it carried excitement in it. The other hounds took it up. "That was Blue Boy," Grandpa said. "Up and coming to have the best nose in the mountains, and that's Little Red right behind him. And there's Bess." Another bay chimed in, this one kind of frantic. Grandpa said, "And there's old Rippet getting in on last." They was in full voice now, moving farther and farther away, their chorus echoing backward and forward until it sounded like hounds all over. Then the sound disappeared. "They're on the backside of Clinch Mountain," Grandpa said. I listened hard, but I couldn't hear anything. A nighthawk went see from the side of the mountain behind us, cutting the air with a sharp whistle. Across the creek, a hoot owl answered him. "Woo, woo, who are you?" Grandpa laughed low. "Owl stays in the hollow, hawk stays on the ridges. Sometimes old hawk figures there's easy pickings around the water, and old owl don't like it." A fish flopped a splash in the creek. I was beginning to get worried. "Reckon," I whispered to Grandpa, "that them hounds is lost?" "Nope," Grandpa said. "We'll hear 'em in a minute, and they'll come out on t'other side of Clinch Mountain and run across that ridge in front of us." Sure enough, they did. First they sounded far off, then louder and louder, and they came baying and yelping long ways along the ridge facing us and crossed the creek somewhere down below. Then they came along the side of the mountain behind us and set off again for Clinch Mountain. This time they ran on the near side of Clinch Mountain, and we heard them all the way across. "Old Slick is tightening up the circle," Grandpa said. "This time, after they crossed the creek, old Slick may lead 'em right in front of us." Grandpa was right. We heard 'em splashing across the creek not far below us, and while they was splashing and baying, Grandpa sat up straight and grabbed my arm. "There he is," Grandpa whispered. And there he was, coming along through willow poles on the creek bank. It was old Slick. He was a-trotting with his tongue hanging out and a bushy tail dangling kind of careless behind him. He had pointed ears, and he jogged along real pickety, taking his time to go around a pile of brush. Once he stopped and lifted a front paw and licked it. Then he turned his head back toward the baying of the hounds and came on. Down in front of me and Grandpa, there were some rocks that stuck up in the water, 5 or 6 of them, that went out nearly to the middle of the creek. When old Slick reached where the rocks were, he stopped and looked back like he was judging how far away the hounds was. And then he sat down calm as you please with his back to us and just sat there looking at the creek. The moon glinted red off his coat, and the hounds was coming closer. Grandpa squeezed my arm. "Watch him now." Old Slick jumped from the creek bank out onto the first rock. He stopped there a minute and danced on the rock. Then he jumped to the next one and danced again, then the next and the next until he reached the last one nearly in the middle of the creek. And then he came back, jumping from rock to rock until he reached the one closest to the creek bank. He stopped and listened again. Then he stepped into the water and splashed up the creek until he was out of sight. He sure cut the time close, because he had no more than disappeared when there come the hounds. Blue Boy was leading, with his nose right on the ground. Old Rip It was crowding him, and Bess and Little Red was bunched right behind. Now and then one of them would raise their nose and give out a ooh that tingled your blood. They came to where the rocks went out into the creek, and Blue Boy never hesitated. Out he went, jumping from rock to rock, and the rest of them right behind. When they reached the last rock in the middle of the creek, Blue Boy stopped, but old Rip It didn't. He jumped right in like there wasn't no doubt about it and started swimming for the other bank. Bess jumped in behind him and started swimming too. Blue Boy raised his nose and commenced to sniff the air, and Little Red stayed there on the rock with him. In a minute, here come Blue Boy and Little Red jumping back on the rocks toward us. They reached the bank, and Blue Boy led the way. Then he hit Old Slick's trail and bayed long and loud, and Little Red chimed in. Bess reversed herself while she was still swimming and come back, while old Rip It was running up and down the other side of the bank at a total loss. He was howling and yelping and running back and forth with his nose on the ground. When he heard Blue Boy, he hit the creek water in a dive and swam so hard he splashed water over his head until he made it to the bank and taken up the trail behind the rest of them. Me and Grandpa laughed so hard we nearly fell off the mountain. I did lose my foot brace and hold on a pine sapling and rolled into cockleburl bushes. Grandpa pulled me out. We was still laughing while we picked the burrs out of my hair. Grandpa said he knew Little Slick would pull that trick, and that's why he chose the place for us to set. He said that without a doubt Old Slick had sat close by and watched the dogs his own self. Grandpa said the reason Old Slick had waited so long for the hounds to get close is that he wanted his scent to be fresh on them rocks, figuring that the hounds' feelings would take over from their scents when they got excited. It worked too with old Rip It and Bess, but not with Blue Boy and Little Red. Grandpa said he had many's the time seen that same old thing. Feelings take over sense, make as big a fool out of people as it had old Rip It, which I reckon is so. It had broke day, and I hadn't even noticed. Me and Grandpa moved down the creek bank clearing and ate our sour biscuits and meat. Dogs was baying back around and coming along the ridge in front of us. The sun topped the mountain, sparkling the trees across the creek, and brought out brush, wrens, and red cardinal. Grandpa slid his knife under the bark of a cedar tree and made a dipper by twisting one end of the bark. We dipped water from the creek, cold where you could see the pebbles on the bottom. The water had a cedary taste that made me hungrier, but we had ate all the biscuits. Grandpa said Old Slick might come up the farther creek bank this time, and we would get to see him again, but we would have to sit quiet. I didn't move, not even when the ants crawled up on my foot, though I wanted to. Grandpa saw him and said it was all right to brush him off. Old Slick wouldn't see me do that, which I did. In a little while, the hounds were below us again, down the creek, and then we saw him lazing up the creek bank on the other side with his tongue hanging out. Grandpa gave a low whistle, and Old Slick stopped and stared across the creek at us. He stood there a minute with his eyes crinkled up like he was grinning at us. Then he snorted and trotted on out of sight. Grandpa said Old Slick snorted because he was disgusted being caused all this inconvenience. I remembered Old Slick had it coming to him. Grandpa said some fellers told that they had heard about foxes swapping out, but he had actually seen it. He said years ago he had been fox trailing and was sitting on a hillock above a meadow clearing. He said the fox, a red one, come along with the hounds behind him and stopped at a hollow tree and give a little bark. He said another fox come out of that hollow tree, and the first one got in. Then the second fox trotted off, leading the dogs on the trail. He said he moved close to that tree and could hear that old fox actually snoring while the hounds was a-passing a few feet from him. He said that old fox had so much confidence in himself that he didn't give a lick damn how close them dogs come to around him. Here comes Blue Boy and the pack up the creek bank. They bayed every step or two. It was a strong trail. They passed out of sight, and in a minute, one bay split off from the rest and broke up into yells and howls. Grandpa cussed. He said, "Damn, old Rip It is trying to cut across again and cheat on old Slick. He's gone and got himself lost in the mountains, such is known as a cheater hound." Grandpa said we would have to set up a hollering and a baying ourselves to guide old Rip It back to us, and that would call off the trailing because the other dogs would come too. So we did. I couldn't give the long holler like Grandpa. It was almost like a yodel. But I did tolerable well, Grandpa said. In a little while, here they come, and old Rip It was ashamed of what he had done. He hung back behind the others, hoping, I reckon, that he would pass unnoticed. Grandpa said it served him right, and maybe this time it would learn him that you can't cheat without making unnecessary trouble for yourself, which proves out as reasonable. The sun had slanted into the afternoon when we left Hanging Gap back down the narrows toward home. The dogs dragged their feet in the trail, and I knew they were tired. I was tired too, and would have had a hard time making it if Grandpa hadn't been so tuckered that he walked along slow. It was dusk evening when we sighted the cabin clearing, and Grandma, she was out on the trail to meet us. She picked me up, though I could have made it, and put an arm around Grandpa's waist. I guess I was tuckered, for I fell asleep on her shoulder and didn't know when we even got to the cabin. End of chapter.